Bonjour, friends, relatives, survivors. I'm Murray Sinclair, former chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. I wanted to take an opportunity to speak to you for a few minutes about the situation that has come to the public's eye about the discovery of bodies at the residential school in Kamloops, British Columbia, here in Canada. When I was asked to chair the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I thought that I had a pretty good idea of what to expect. My experience as a lawyer, as a judge, as the co-chair of the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry of Manitoba in the early 1990s, had given me a considerable amount of information about what Indigenous people had experienced here in Canada. And I thought that residential schools were part of the story, but that there was a lot more that would relate to what was going on outside the community in this current day and age. Discovering what was going on in the schools, I thought, would be accomplished by listening to what survivors told us and recording their stories. And I undertook that part of the work openly, willingly, with what I thought was a good understanding of what they were going to tell us. And they did share with us a great deal of information about their individual experiences in the schools, about having been taken away from their families at such young ages. We called our interim report "They Came for the Children" for that very reason. We wanted to draw the attention of the Canadian public to the fact that the Government of Canada set out in a deliberate policy to remove the children away from their parents, from their communities, and from the influences of their elders, their brothers, their sisters, in order to indoctrinate them into a different culture. And they accomplished that to a large extent. By the thousands, children were taken away and placed in those institutions called residential schools. And we identified the people who were responsible for that policy, for those decisions. The Prime Minister of the day, Sir John A. Macdonald, led the way, but he was assisted in his public leadership by others. Egerton Ryerson, who had developed a proposal about public schools, himself said that public schools should be available for the little white children of the settlements and the colonies, because the Indigenous children were not smart enough, that they were inferior and couldn't be educated in the same way and would not be eligible to become leaders in Canadian society because they were so uncivilized and heathens and savages. But the stories from the survivors proved to be pretty horrendous. And one of the most common stories that we heard were from survivors who talked about the children who died in the schools and whose deaths they witnessed. We heard about children who died from accidents, children who died from beatings, children who died when they ran away and never returned. We heard about some of the children who even took their own lives. We heard about children who deliberately burned down the schools and in that way caused the deaths of children in the schools. And we heard about, of course, the abuses they experienced. We heard about the day-to-day violence that they experienced. But just as often, for every single one of them, we heard about the loneliness. We heard about the separation from their family. We heard about how they lost so much to what they experienced in the schools. But the one aspect of residential schools that really proved to be quite shocking to me personally was the stories that we began to gather of the children who died in the schools, of the children who who died sometimes deliberately at the hands of others who were there, and in such large numbers. Survivors talked about, during the time that they were there, about children who suddenly went missing. Some of the survivors talked about witnessing children being buried in large numbers into mass burial sites. Some of the survivors talked about infants who were born to young girls at the residential schools who had been fathered by priests, having those infants taken away from them and deliberately killed, sometimes by being thrown into furnaces, they told us. We had no expectation that this would be part of the work that we were doing, so we asked the government to allow us to conduct a fuller inquiry into that part of the work of the TRC in order to explore that on behalf of the survivors and the Canadian public. We submitted a proposal because it was not within our mandate, and we asked that it be funded by the government, and that request was denied. And so largely we did what we could, but it was not anywhere near what we needed to accomplish and needed to investigate. And now we're beginning to see evidence of the numbers of children who died. We know that there were probably lots of sites similar to Kamloops that are going to come to light in the future. And we need to begin to prepare ourselves for that. Those who are survivors of the residential schools, including the intergenerational survivors, need to understand that this evidence is important to make available to Canada so that Canada can understand the magnitude of what it is that they did and what it is that they contributed to, but also can understand the magnitude of their responsibility to stop hiding the documents, to force the churches who have documents to disclose those documents so that we can get to the truth of that experience. Since the revelation of what was discovered at Kamloops has come to light, I have been inundated with phone calls from survivors. By the dozens, if not hundreds now, they've called me, often just to cry, just to tell us, I told you so. I told you that this had happened. And now we're beginning to see it. And in their voices I can hear not only the pain and the anguish, but also the anger that they were feeling about the fact that nobody believed them when they told those stories. And in addition to that, I can also hear their sense that they've lost some hope. They've lost the faint glimmer of hope that maybe the children who they knew did not return maybe had gone away to live somewhere else and still might be found. And now they think that maybe that might not be feasible, that option might not be available, and I can hear that as well. So my heart goes out to the survivors. My heart goes out to the children of survivors and the families of survivors who never made it back. I know this is a hard time, but we must persevere. We must persevere in our continued investigation of what we need to know about these schools. And at the same time, we need to ensure that we work hard to try to put in place healing programs and foundations that will help survivors to be able to gather from time to time in order to share their common experiences. Just like veterans from the wars are allowed to gather together in their own unique places, we need to provide such places for survivors of residential schools as well. So I pray for you all. I hope that you can find a way to be able to continue on with your life in a good and healthy way despite this revelation. I hope that you are able to see that there is something here that we can do about this. Thank you. Miigwech.